My wife went on a business trip against my wishes, so I tracked her down, served her divorce papers, destroyed her lover, and vanished without trace. 5 years later, I got shocking news about my wife. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, my fingers clenched around the frame, knuckles white from the grip. Outside, the wind howled like a mad dog, and inside, everything felt just as stormy. Claire, my wife of 12 years, was zipping up her suitcase, oblivious to the destruction she was about to unleash. I couldn't believe this was happening. Again. Jack, I've told you already. This business trip is important. We're close to landing the biggest client our firm has ever seen, Claire snapped, her eyes cold, not even glancing my way. She was dressed sharp, as always, tailored black blazer, sleek skirt, the heels that clicked with authority. It was that same coldness I had seen for months now, maybe years. Something had changed in Claire, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was when she got promoted to senior marketing director at her company, Advision. She was 36, a powerhouse, and always the smartest person in the room. But this was more than just the pressure of the job. Claire, I don't care about your promotion or your client. I'm telling you, don't go. Not this time, I pleaded, my voice cracking just enough to expose how much it hurt. At 40, I wasn't the type to beg, but damn it, I loved her. I was still holding on to some hope that things could go back to how they were. She finally looked at me, but her eyes didn't soften. Jack, you're being ridiculous. This is work, not some conspiracy you've cooked up in your head. I'd had enough. I wasn't an idiot. I knew what she thought of me, a washed-up ex-cop who retired early after that injury took me out of the field. She worked with billion-dollar clients, I fixed motorcycles in the garage and ran a small auto repair shop. But I had instincts, and every instinct screamed at me that Claire wasn't just going to work. Not this time. You think I don't know? I said, my voice low but sharp. Her hand froze on the zipper. You think I haven't seen the texts, the late nights, the emergency meetings? Who is he, Claire? For a split second, there was a flicker in her eyes, fear, guilt, or maybe just surprise that I had the nerve to confront her. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by that damn icy stare again. I don't have time for this, she said, finishing with the suitcase. She picked it up, like it was the most casual thing in the world, like we weren't standing on the edge of a cliff. Claire, I shouted, my hand slamming the door shut as she tried to leave. If you walk out that door, you'll regret it. She gave me one last look, a mixture of pity and frustration, and walked past me without a word. The click of her heels on the hardwood echoed through the hallway, louder than any scream. That was it. She was gone. I stood there in stunned silence as I heard her car engine rev up and fade into the night. I let out a deep breath and slowly unclenched my fists, feeling the blood rush back into my fingers. My mind was spinning, but I knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going on a business trip. Not this time. For weeks, I had suspected something was wrong, and that night confirmed it. I had caught a glimpse of a text message weeks ago from someone named Ryan. She brushed it off as a colleague, but I knew better. This was personal, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I walked over to my desk, pulled open the drawer, and there it was, a sleek, silver GPS tracker. I had never wanted to use it. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, maybe I could trust her, but now, I had to know the truth. I had already slipped the tracker into the lining of her suitcase earlier, hoping I wouldn't need to activate it. But she made her choice. I flipped open my laptop, pulled up the tracking software, and waited. A red dot blinked onto the screen, showing her exact location. She was heading out of town, just as I suspected, but not toward the airport. Instead, she was driving in the opposite direction, toward a small, isolated cabin in the mountains. My heart pounded. She wasn't alone, and I was about to prove it. The drive was a blur, anger and adrenaline fueling every mile. By the time I reached the cabin, it was dark, and the only light came from a flickering lamp inside. Her car was parked outside, alongside a sleek black Mercedes. I clenched my fists. This was it, the proof I needed. I crept up to the window and peered inside. There she was, sitting on a plush leather couch, a glass of wine in hand, laughing. And next to her, his hand on her knee, was Ryan, her colleague, as she called him. He looked to be in his mid-30s, younger than me, suave, the kind of guy who probably thought he could steal another man's wife without consequence. I felt my blood boil, but I wasn't about to storm in there and make a scene. No, I had a plan. I pulled out the manila envelope from my jacket pocket, the divorce papers I had already drawn up months ago. I had been waiting for the right moment, and now it was staring me in the face. I walked up to the door and knocked, calm as ever. When Claire answered, her face drained of color. She knew. She knew the moment she saw me standing there that everything was about to come crashing down. Jack? Her voice trembled. Surprise, I said, shoving the papers into her hands. Ryan stood up, but before he could say a word, I turned to him and smiled. You might want to find another place to stay tonight, Ryan. I'm sure my wife will fill you in on the details. Claire stood frozen, clutching the divorce papers like they were a bomb about to go off. I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked away, leaving the door wide open behind me. But as I got into my car, I knew this wasn't over. I wasn't just going to take my wife down, I was going to destroy everything Ryan held dear too. I didn't sleep that night, not that I expected to. After serving Claire those divorce papers, after watching her face go pale as she realized I wasn't just some oblivious, heartbroken fool, I knew the real game had only just begun. By morning, my phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls from Claire, texts ranging from desperate apologies to half-hearted threats. I didn't respond. I wanted her to stew in it. Instead, I spent the early hours pacing my garage, thinking, planning. It was always in the quiet moments when my mind became sharp. After years as a detective, I learned how to think several steps ahead, how to let people dig their own graves. Ryan was no exception. Who did he think he was, waltzing into my marriage and treating me like I was some washed-up nobody? Claire might have thought I was too caught up in the garage to notice her slipping away, but I had been watching closely. I knew she was dissatisfied, resentful of my early retirement. I even knew she'd been complaining about me to her co-workers, but she didn't know how deep I could cut. Not yet. Claire had no idea what was coming for Ryan. By mid-afternoon, Claire finally stopped texting. That's when I knew the next move was coming. She had shifted into problem-solving mode. It was only a matter of time before she tried to call me directly or, God help her, show up at the house. I was right. Around 5 p.m., there was a sharp knock at the door. I opened it, and there she was, Claire. She looked disheveled, panicked, as though the weight of what had happened was just now crashing down on her. Gone was the confident, icy woman who left for her business trip. Now she was just someone desperate to clean up the mess she had made. Jack, we need to talk. Please, Claire said, her voice tight, eyes wide. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and stared at her in silence. It made her fidget, which was exactly what I wanted. Talk about what, Claire? The fact that you're fucking your coworker, or the fact that you lied to my face 4 months? I asked, my voice calm but laced with venom. Her lips quivered. It's not like that, Jack. Ryan is not. It's complicated. Complicated, I scoffed, shaking my head. You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see this coming? Claire hesitated, her eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness, but there was none. I wasn't interested in forgiving her, not yet. She wasn't here for love or redemption. She was here because she was scared of losing control, scared of her perfect life crumbling. I didn't want this, she whispered. I was lonely, Jack. You shut me out, and Ryan, he listened to me. Spare me the sob story, Claire, I snapped, cutting her off. You made your bed. You chose him. Now you get to live with it. But before you go thinking you can fix this, there's something you need to know. Her eyebrows furrowed. What are you talking about? I stepped back, letting her into the house. As she walked past me, her familiar perfume filled the air, a scent that once brought me comfort but now only sickened me. Sit down, I ordered, pointing to the kitchen table. Claire obeyed, though her confusion was clear. I took my time, letting the tension build as I grabbed a folder from the counter and placed it in front of her. What's this? She asked, eyeing it nervously. Open it, I said, leaning back in my chair, arms folded. Claire hesitated but slowly lifted the cover. Inside were printouts, dozens of documents I had been gathering for weeks. Photos of Ryan, financial statements, emails I had managed to recover from Claire's account. But what really caught her attention were the photos of Ryan at his desk, looking over confidential files from his company, files he was never supposed to have. What is this, Jack? Claire's voice was shaky now, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. You thought Ryan was just a fling, didn't you? I said, my voice low and measured. Just some guy you could run off with and leave me in the dust. Well, let me tell you something about your lover. Ryan isn't just a marketing executive. He's a thief. And now, thanks to you, I've got all the proof I need to bring him down. Claire looked up at me, her face pale. Jack, no. You don't understand. He wasn't. I leaned forward, my eyes locked onto hers. Ryan's been stealing from his company 4 months. Embezzling. Money laundering. You really thought he was interested in you because of loneliness? He used you, Claire. He used your position, your access to files, to cover his tracks. And now Now he's going to pay for it. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization was sinking in. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd been played by Ryan, just like I knew she would be. I've already sent some of this to the right people. The feds are going to come knocking at his door soon enough. But don't worry, Claire. You won't be implicated yet. That is, unless you try to stop what's coming. Tears welled up in her eyes. Jack, please. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I watched her crumble in front of me, her whole world collapsing as she realized the gravity of the situation. But I wasn't done. There was one more card I had to play, and it was the one that would break her completely. There's something else, I said, my voice quieter now, more calculated. Claire wiped her tears, her breath shaky. What more could you possibly do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled out my phone, tapped a few buttons, and slid it across the table to her. A video started playing, and as soon as she saw it, her face drained of every last drop of color. It was footage from inside the cabin, the same cabin she and Ryan had been laughing in the night before. But this wasn't just any footage. This was footage I had captured using a hidden camera I planted before she even left. The sound was crystal clear. Their conversation was damning. They had discussed everything, his plans, her role in helping him, the affair, the lies. But then came the twist. Ryan wasn't just talking about money or the affair. He was talking about something darker. You didn't think I'd let her go that easily, did you? Ryan's voice echoed through the speakers, the smug grin on his face unmistakable as he leaned in toward Claire. Once we're done with this deal, Claire, we'll make sure Jack doesn't stand in our way. He'll disappear. Permanently. Claire gasped, her hands covering her mouth as she realized what she was hearing. Ryan had planned to get rid of me. For good. I leaned back, watching as the horror unfolded on her face. You thought you were in control, Claire, but the truth is, you've been nothing but a pawn in his game. And now I've got everything I need to destroy him. She was silent for what felt like an eternity, her chest heaving with silent sobs. I could see the fear in her eyes, fear for what Ryan had planned, fear for what she had become entangled in, and most of all, fear for what I might do next. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. What are you going to do? I stood up, towering over her, and for the first time in years, I felt the power shift back into my hands. I'm going to vanish, Claire. You won't see me again after today. But before I go, I'm going to ruin Ryan. I'll make sure he gets exactly what's coming to him. And as for you, I paused, letting the words sink in. You can sit back and watch your life fall apart, knowing it all started with one stupid lie. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder. Oh, and Claire, don't try to run. You'll only make it worse. With that, I walked out, leaving her in the wreckage of her choices. But this was far from over. Ryan thought he was untouchable. He had no idea what was coming next. I disappeared. That night, I packed a single bag, left my phone behind, and walked out the door of the house I had built with Claire. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, not that there was anyone left who cared. In the eyes of the world, Jack Mercer was gone, and in his place was a ghost, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I'd planned this for months. Every detail had been carefully calculated, from the moment I discovered Claire's affair to the second I handed her those divorce papers. Everything was set in motion, and now, as I vanished into the night, I knew that the next phase of my plan was about to unfold. Ryan Parker, the man who thought he could steal my wife, my life, and everything I had built, was about to learn what it meant to lose. I didn't just disappear physically, I erased every trace of myself. I knew how to cover my tracks. Years in law enforcement had taught me that much. I ditched my car 2 towns over, bought a cheap burner phone, and took on a new identity. It wasn't hard to find the right people, those who lived off the grid, people with no love for the law. In exchange for a little cash and a few favors, I was able to secure everything I needed: new documents, a place to stay, and a network of informants who would keep me in the loop without drawing any suspicion. But I wasn't just hiding, I was hunting. I knew Ryan wouldn't waste time. Men like him always thought they were invincible, especially when they believed they had the upper hand. Claire might have been shattered when I left her, but Ryan? He was too arrogant, too greedy to see the storm brewing. I knew he'd try to bury the evidence, cover his tracks, and spin the narrative in his favor. But he had no idea that I had already set the wheels of his destruction in motion. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers. Ryan's company, the place where he had risen so high on stolen money and backdoor deals, was suddenly under investigation. It started small, an anonymous tip about some irregularities in the books, a quiet audit that quickly turned into a full-blown investigation. The feds moved in fast, seizing files, computers, and every scrap of evidence that would tie Ryan to his crimes. And then came the media. Ryan Parker's face was plastered on every news station, his name linked to words like embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. The once celebrated executive was now a pariah, scrambling to hold onto his empire as everything crumbled around him. His co-workers, his friends, they all turned on him the moment they smelled blood. It didn't take long for them to start talking, spilling every dirty secret they had about Ryan's shady dealings. I watched it all from the shadows, unseen and unheard. I didn't need to be there in person to see his downfall, I could feel it, like a weight lifting off my chest. Ryan was falling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But I wasn't done yet. I had learned something important in my time as a detective. The best way to destroy a man wasn't to take his money or his career, it was to take his pride. And Ryan's pride had always been his greatest weakness. He thought he could outsmart me, outmaneuver me, but he never realized that the game had been rigged from the start. I knew exactly where to hit him next. Ryan wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who thrived on control, especially over the women in his life. Claire wasn't his first affair. In fact, she wasn't even his most important one. Ryan had a history with women, secretaries, assistants, even interns. He used them, manipulated them, and when they were no longer useful, he discarded them. But what Ryan didn't know was that some of those women had started talking. I had made sure of it. I tracked down Emily, his former assistant. She was young, maybe 24 now, with a quiet, fragile demeanor. She hadn't been working for Ryan long, but I knew from her emails and text messages that their relationship had been far from professional. Emily had tried to keep her head down after she left the company, moving to a new city and taking on a new job, but the weight of what had happened still hung over her. When I finally found her, she was hesitant at first, unsure of what I wanted. "I don't want to be involved in any of this," she said, her voice shaking as we sat across from each other in a small cafe. "I've moved on." I leaned in, my voice calm but firm. "I understand, Emily, but this isn't just about you. Ryan used you. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. The only way to stop him is to make sure he pays for what he's done." She stared at her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. I could see the conflict in her eyes, fear, anger, shame. Ryan had taken something from her, something she could never get back. And now, after all these years, she was finally being given a chance to take it back. "What do you need from me?" she asked quietly. "Your story," I said, sliding a recorder across the table. "The truth. All of it." It didn't take long for Emily's story to make its way into the hands of the right people. Within weeks, more women came forward, each with their own stories of Ryan's manipulation, harassment, and abuse. The media had a field day, and soon, Ryan wasn't just a financial criminal, he was a predator, a man who had built his career on the backs of the vulnerable. I could almost hear the walls closing in on him. Ryan tried to fight back, of course. Men like him always do. He hired the best lawyers, made desperate public statements, and even tried to paint himself as the victim. But the damage was done. His company distanced itself from him, his friends abandoned him, and the women he had once controlled were now speaking out against him in a chorus of condemnation. And Claire? She was caught in the middle of it all. She had chosen him, aligned herself with him, and now she was drowning in the fallout. Every time I saw her face on the news, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she tried to explain how she didn't know, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. She had been a fool, but Ryan had been a monster. But just when I thought it was all over, that Ryan had been thoroughly crushed, I got a call that changed everything. It was from one of my old contacts, someone who still worked in law enforcement. "Jack," the voice on the other end said, "you might want to sit down for this." "What is it?" I asked, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "It's Ryan. He's dead." For a moment, I couldn't process what I had just heard. Dead? Ryan Parker? It didn't make sense. He was supposed to rot in a prison cell, not escape his fate through death. "How?" I finally asked, my voice barely audible. "They are saying it was a suicide," the voice continued. "He was found in his apartment this morning. Left a note and everything." My mind raced, but something didn't sit right. Ryan wasn't the type to take the easy way out. He was a fighter, a man who would claw his way back to the top no matter how many times he was knocked down. Suicide didn't fit his profile. And then it hit me. "What about the note?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "They haven't released the details yet, but from what I've heard, it's cryptic. Almost like he was trying to send a message." I hung up the phone, my mind spinning with possibilities. Ryan Parker was dead, and yet, something about it didn't feel right. Was it really suicide? Or was this his final move, a twisted attempt to escape the consequences of his actions? There was only one way to find out. As I packed my bag once again, preparing to return to the city I had left behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan's death wasn't the end of the story. No, this was just the beginning. Returning to the city was surreal, like stepping into the ruins of a war I had left behind. The skyline looked the same, the familiar hum of life still buzzing in the streets, but the air felt heavy with everything that had happened. 5 years gone, and yet here I was again, drawn back into a place that had once felt like home. I kept a low profile, blending in with the anonymity of the crowd as I navigated the streets toward Ryan's former apartment. It wasn't hard to get access, I still had my old contacts in law enforcement, and despite my disappearance, a few favors went a long way. They didn't know the whole story, but they didn't need to. I just needed a foot in the door, a way to get close enough to see if the suspicions gnawing at my gut were right. Ryan Parker, dead by suicide. It felt wrong, too convenient. Men like him didn't bow out gracefully, not without a fight. Something darker was at play here, and I was determined to find out what it was. The first place I went was his apartment. It was a luxurious place, top-floor penthouse with all the trappings of a man who lived his life in excess. It was still sealed off by the authorities, but that wasn't much of a barrier. With a few deft moves, I slipped inside, careful to avoid any surveillance still in place. The scene was pristine, almost too pristine. The kind of neatness that screamed of staging. I walked through the rooms, taking in every detail. His body had been found in the bedroom, slumped against the bed with an empty bottle of pills on the nightstand. They said he left a note, but I hadn't been able to get my hands on it yet. But I could feel something off. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or broken objects. Just calm, eerie calm. I stepped closer to the bed, looking for anything the investigators might have missed. That's when I saw it. A small, barely noticeable indent on the floor, right near the edge of the bed frame. It was faint, but it caught my attention, the kind of mark someone might leave if they had been kneeling on the floor, perhaps to position a body. I crouched down, running my fingers over the spot. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me question everything. Someone had been here. Someone else had been involved. The next stop was the police station. I had a few favors left to cash in, and this one was the most important of all. Ryan's suicide note hadn't been made public, but with the right persuasion, I managed to get a look at it. The note was strange, just as my contact had hinted. It was brief, almost cryptic. I did it. I couldn't face the consequences. She knows everything. Who was she? Claire? It couldn't have been. Claire had been living her own nightmare ever since I walked out of her life. She had disappeared from the public eye, her reputation ruined by Ryan's downfall. I hadn't kept close tabs on her after I left. Watching her spiral downwards was just another consequence of her betrayal. But now, her name was back on my radar. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, Claire was involved. Finding her wasn't difficult. Claire had retreated to a small house on the outskirts of the city, far from the glamorous life she had once enjoyed. I'd done enough research to know she was barely scraping by, no longer the polished, well-dressed woman she had been when we were together. The media had been ruthless to her after Ryan's scandals broke, and she had become a ghost, much like me. But I wasn't ready to show up at her door just yet. I needed more information, more pieces to the puzzle before I confronted her. I dug deeper into Ryan's life, and it wasn't long before I uncovered something shocking. The police had missed a key piece of the investigation, a second insurance policy Ryan had taken out just months before his death, one worth millions. The beneficiary? Claire. The twist hit me like a punch to the gut. Claire, who had been left with nothing, had suddenly been named in a life insurance policy that would make her a very wealthy woman after Ryan's death. She wasn't innocent in this. She couldn't be. But why? What had driven her to this? Was it revenge, desperation, or something else entirely? I needed answers, and there was only one person left who could give them to me. I waited until the evening, watching from a distance as Claire returned to her small, modest house. She moved differently now, no longer the confident woman I had once known. She looked older, tired, worn down by the years of scandal and betrayal. But there was something else in her posture, a tension, as if she was still carrying a weight that hadn't yet been lifted. I knocked on the door. When she opened it, her face drained of color. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I could see the shock in her eyes, the disbelief that I was standing on her doorstep after all these years. But behind the shock, there was something else. Guilt. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? I think you know why I'm here, Claire." She stepped aside, letting me in, but the tension between us was palpable. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, the way her hand shook as she closed the door behind me. I didn't waste any time. Ryan's dead, I said bluntly, watching her reaction closely, and you're the beneficiary of his life insurance. Her eyes widened, but she didn't deny it. I didn't kill him, she said quickly, almost too quickly. I didn't say you did, I interrupted, my voice cold. But I need to know the truth, Claire, all of it. For a long moment, there was silence. Claire stood there, her back against the wall, as if the weight of her secrets was finally pressing down on her. I waited, giving her the space she needed, knowing that the truth would come out eventually. And then, slowly, she began to speak. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan, he promised me everything. After you left, I was lost. I didn't know what to do. He told me he'd take care of me, that we could start over, but it all fell apart. She paused, her hands trembling as she spoke. After the scandal, he became paranoid. He was always looking over his shoulder, always afraid that someone was going to come after him. He started drinking, doing drugs. He wasn't the man I thought he was. He became violent, Jack. He threatened me. Her voice broke, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Not now. So what happened? I pressed, my voice steady. Why the insurance policy? Why his sudden death? Claire looked away, wiping the tears from her face. I didn't want any of this, she said, her voice shaking. I didn't want him to die, Jack, but he made a deal with the wrong people, and when he couldn't deliver, they came for him. My heart skipped a beat. Who? The people he owed money to, she whispered. They weren't just businessmen. They were criminals, dangerous people, and when he couldn't pay them back, they came for him. I didn't know what to do. The pieces started falling into place. Ryan hadn't committed suicide. He had been murdered, eliminated by the very people he had tried to scam. And Claire, caught in the crossfire, had been left with no choice but to take the life insurance money as a way to survive. But there was still one question left unanswered. Why didn't you come to me? I asked, my voice softer now. Claire looked at me, her eyes filled with regret. Because I thought you hated me, she whispered. After everything I did, after the affair, I thought you'd never forgive me. I stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. Part of me did hate her, even after all these years. But another part, the part that had once loved her, couldn't help but feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and she had paid the price. But in the end, she had been just another pawn in Ryan's game. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Claire, I said quietly. But I do know one thing. She looked at me, hope flickering in her eyes. This isn't over. As I walked out of her house that night, I knew that the truth was finally in my hands. Ryan Parker was dead, but the people who had killed him were still out there, and now, it was up to me to make sure they paid for what they had done. But this time, I wasn't going to disappear. This time, I was going to finish what I started. As I left Claire's house, the night air felt heavier than before. The weight of what I'd just uncovered gnawed at me. Ryan hadn't been some reckless playboy who simply met his end through his own stupidity. He'd been tangled in something much darker, and somehow Claire had been dragged down with him. But even with all her tears and regrets, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Her fear was real, that much I knew, but Claire was holding back. I could see it in her eyes, that flicker of hesitation when she talked about the dangerous people Ryan had crossed. I needed to know who they were and how deep this went. If Ryan had made enemies, those enemies wouldn't stop at him. Claire could be in danger, and now, so could I. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, shadowy meetings, and old contacts. I started digging into Ryan's finances, his business deals, and, more importantly, the debts he owed. The man had been a walking disaster waiting to happen. He had borrowed money from unsavory characters, betting on the stock market, running risky side deals, and losing more than he won. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the pattern became. Ryan had gotten mixed up with an underground crime syndicate known for laundering money and making people disappear when they didn't pay up. These weren't just some street thugs or petty criminals, they were professionals, ruthless and efficient. Claire had been living with a ticking time bomb, and Ryan's death hadn't diffused it, it had only set it off. What disturbed me most was that Ryan had taken out the second life insurance policy just weeks before his death, naming Claire as the sole beneficiary. She had played the part of the grieving widow well, but had she really known what Ryan was involved in? Had she been playing both sides, waiting for the right moment to cash in? I didn't have time for hesitation. If the syndicate knew about Claire, they would come for her next. I wasn't about to let that happen. I may have left her behind years ago, but there was still a part of me that couldn't turn away from someone I once loved, even if she had betrayed me. I tracked down one of Ryan's old business partners, a slimy guy named Mark Travers, who had been involved in some of Ryan's riskier ventures. Mark was the type of guy who would sell out his own mother if it meant staying out of trouble. I figured if anyone knew how deep Ryan had gone with these criminals, it would be him. Mark didn't want to talk at first, too scared, too jittery, but a few choice words and a flash of old favors owed softened him up. He spilled everything. Ryan had been desperate to cover his debts and had made promises he couldn't keep. When the syndicate came knocking, demanding their money, Ryan had tried to buy more time. He had even planned to use Claire as leverage, though how he meant to do that, I wasn't sure. But here's where things got interesting. Ryan hadn't just owed money, he had something they wanted. Something big enough to kill for. The next day, I went back to Claire. This time, there was no hesitation in her eyes when she opened the door. She looked worn out, like she had been expecting me, like she knew that I wouldn't stop digging until I found the truth. "What do you want, Jack?" she asked, her voice soft but resigned. "I know everything, Claire," I said, stepping inside. Ryan wasn't just in debt. He was into something much bigger, something dangerous. What was he hiding? She froze, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer, that she'd just keep spinning the same story she'd been feeding me since I came back into her life. But then, finally, she sighed. "There's something I didn't tell you," she admitted. "Ryan, he had this file. I don't know what it was, but it was important. He kept it hidden, like he was afraid of it. I found it one night when he was passed out drunk. There were documents, names, bank accounts, stuff I didn't understand. I think he was planning to use it as leverage, to blackmail the people he owed." "What happened to it?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "He destroyed most of it, but I think there's still something left, something they are looking for." Everything started falling into place. The life insurance policy, the debts, the mysterious file. Ryan had been trying to outmaneuver people far more dangerous than he could handle, and now I was stuck in the middle of his mess. But I wasn't going to run. Not this time. That night, I watched Claire's house from a distance. It was only a matter of time before they came for her, and when they did, I would be ready. I still had a few tricks up my sleeve from my time off the grid, and I wasn't going to let these people get to Claire, no matter what. It was just after midnight when I saw the shadows move. 3 men, dressed in black, slipped quietly through the gate. I had expected them sooner, but these guys were patient, professionals. I waited until they were close to the house before making my move. I stepped out from the shadows, my heart pounding but my mind steady. The element of surprise was on my side. I had spent the last 5 years preparing for moments like this, when everything would come down to a single decision. "Looking for something?" I called out, my voice calm. The men stopped in their tracks, surprised but not rattled. The leader, a tall guy with cold eyes, stepped forward. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Walk away." I chuckled darkly. "You have no idea how much this concerns me." Before he could react, I reached inside my jacket and pulled out a weapon I had hoped I wouldn't have to use. But there it was, cold steel in my hand, a symbol of the life I had walked away from. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "Funny," I said, my voice steady. I was about to say the same thing. The fight was quick and brutal. These men were trained, but so was I. In a matter of minutes, it was over. They were lying unconscious on the ground, and I was still standing. I wasn't done yet. I searched their pockets, finding exactly what I expected, an encrypted drive, hidden carefully among their gear. Whatever they had come for, this was it. Ryan's leverage, the final piece of the puzzle. I pocketed the drive and left them there, knowing they wouldn't stay down for long. But by the time they woke up, Claire and I would be gone. I knocked on Claire's door one last time, and when she opened it, I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew what had happened, could probably guess by the look on my face. "We need to go," I said. "Now." She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. We grabbed what little she had and left the city before the sun came up. The drive was quiet. Claire sat beside me, her face pale and her hands trembling. But I didn't say a word. There was no need. We both knew that things would never go back to the way they were. Too much had happened. Too many betrayals, too many lies. As we crossed the city limits, I felt a strange sense of closure. The life I had built, the man I had become after disappearing, it was all behind me now. I had come back for answers, for revenge, for closure. But in the end, what I got was something I hadn't expected. A new beginning. We drove until the city disappeared from view, fading into the horizon like a distant memory. And as we crossed the border into a new life, I couldn't help but feel like, for the first time in years, I was finally free.